I want to suggest to you tonight that the question of whether or not Israel survives has nothing to do with all the things that you think it has to do with. You're thinking that we're going to talk about Iranian nukes, and you think we're going to talk about the two-state solution, and you think we're going to talk about the United Nations, and you're going to think we're going to talk about the really interesting question of why Bibi Netanyahu and Ehud Barak are conducting their discussion of whether or not Israel should bomb Iran in the very secret location of the front page of Haaretz. And you're thinking, oh, we know why they're doing that, because Ahmadinejad doesn't speak Hebrew, so obviously that's not a problem. So I will explain to you later on, perhaps, why that is actually not intended to be secret, and it's for his, actually not for his consumption, it's for Washington's consumption. But we'll come back to that. But I want to suggest to you tonight that Israel has to face all these issues. There's no question that Hamas is an issue, Hezbollah is an issue, Islamic Jihad is an issue, Syria is becoming a problem, Egypt already is a problem. It's a bad neighborhood. But it's not what's going to determine whether Israel survives or not. What I want to suggest to you this evening is that what will determine whether or not Israel survives is the question of whether or not those people who care about Israel, Israel's own citizens, Israel's Jewish supporters around the world, Israel's Christian and other supporters around the world, can articulate to themselves why it is that Israel matters. And I would go so far as to suggest to you that many people who think of themselves as ardent Zionists cannot actually articulate why the country matters. You have a kind of a visceral sense. It'd be a very bad thing if something terrible happened to it. But when somebody says, but why? I mean, really, for 2,000 years, the Jews survived without a state. So after 63 years or 64 years of independence, 2,000 years of ability to survive without sovereignty is all of a sudden erased? That it would be sad? Yes. That it would be somehow devastating? Why? You got to be able to answer that question. And when people push, then the answer always has something to do with, well, if it goes bad in Buenos Aires, Argentinian Jews need a place to go. And if it gets bad in Paris, French Jews need a place to go. That's also true, but it's not enough of a reason to sustain an entire sovereign nation state at a very heavy cost, because one day things in Buenos Aires or Paris or even London could go south. So I want to suggest to you that if we actually, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember index cards, but for the people in college now, they were about the size of an iPhone, and they had lines on them. But they didn't actually have keys, or, they couldn't swipe them. You actually had to write on them. But I would suggest to you that if it had been the days of index cards, or in the modern times, if I said to you, take out your iPhone or your BlackBerry and write on one screen why it is critical that the Jewish state survive, and you can't talk about refugees from other kinds of places, and you can't talk about the lack of bar mitzvah destinations, and you can't talk about a lot of other kinds of things, I'm going to suggest to you that a lot of people would actually have a lot of trouble saying something terribly articulate. And that, it seems to me, is the crux of the matter. You and I live in a generation in which Israel's existence, especially among a younger generation, is taken to be as natural and as guaranteed as the rising of the sun tomorrow. We live in a generation in which Israel seems to be, despite whatever threats it may face, relatively secure, an enormous military power. Some people think that's great, some people think that's terrible, but it's clearly a military power, and therefore it's a younger generation that doesn't typically have to ask itself why it matters. And what I would like to suggest to you this evening is that the reason that it matters has nothing to do, first and foremost, with bar mitzvah destinations, and secondly, nothing to do with Parisian or Argentinian Jews. It also has nothing to do with the conflict. The conflict is an impediment to Israel's survival. It is not a reason for Israel's survival. The United States is not about Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States is about certain virtues and certain values, about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is about unprecedented opportunity for the very many nations that came to its shores. It is about being the richest, fullest version of democracy anywhere on planet Earth. Not a perfect democracy, but a very impressive one. It is about a lot of things. It is not about Iraq, and it's not about Afghanistan. It is in Iraq, and it is in Afghanistan. And you can think that that's terrific, you can think that that's terrible, you can think that it's necessary but it should end, you can think whatever you think, but you cannot think that the United States is about Iraq and Afghanistan. And by that account, Israel is not about the conflict with the Palestinians or its conflict with the Arab world. It is in a conflict with the Palestinians, and it is in a conflict with the Arab world, tragically in both cases. But it is not about that. But the truth is that you and I, if we were to do some sort of oral Rorschach test, and I said to you a word, and you had to say a word in response, and I said Israel, most people would say something like conflict, checkpoints, danger, guns, bombs, Arabs, whatever they would say. Because our instinct is, if you say, somebody says, did you see the article about Israel on the front page? You just assume that it's going to be about the conflict. It could be about a cure for cancer. It could be about something about ethnic democracy. It could be about the rebirth of the idea of the sovereign nation state. It could be about a lot of different kinds of things, but you assume that it's going to be about the conflict. And I'm suggesting to you is that's what we have to transcend. As long as we think about Israel as being about the conflict, younger generations of both Israelis and supporters of Israel beyond the borders of Israel will increasingly say it's getting exhausting. If we can turn the conversation about Israel into something that acknowledges that there is a very serious and tragic conflict with the Palestinians and Muslims in the area, and ridiculously, Muslims all over the world, then we'll acknowledge that we have to address that conflict, but we'll at least be able to say that the conflict is not the core of what Israel's about. That's what I'm going to say. So sleep well.